A black woman stood calm on the courthouse steps, her briefcase firm in her grip. No criminal intent, no misstep, she was simply walking into work. Then, without warning, a uniformed officer's hand struck her face with brutal force and a venomous insult. "Dirty animals like you don't belong in courthouses." Her stunned lips stung, her papers scattered like wounded birds, and she lay cuffed just feet from the courtroom where she should have entered as an arbiter of justice. The water ran red with humiliation, and in that moment it seemed the system had consumed her. But nobody, including that officer, realized what was coming next. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a defendant. She was the judge. And by the end of that day, the very gavel she was denied would fall on him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How does a respected judge end up beaten and arrested outside her own courthouse? Just hours before she was scheduled to hear arguments in a high-profile civil rights case, Judge Lorraine Jacobs was dragged across the pavement like a criminal. The very institution she served was the one that branded her guilty without trial. Her reputation, her dignity, and her authority were stripped away in a single humiliating moment. But the question that haunted every witness wasn't just about the slap they saw or the handcuffs that bit into her wrists. It was about what fueled Officer Blake Ramirez's rage. Was this a random act of unchecked violence, or was it something deeper, something far more personal that connected him to her courtroom? Why did a decorated officer risk everything on a lie that unraveled within hours? What secret was Officer Ramirez protecting when he struck Judge Jacobs? And how could a single incident spiral into a scandal so explosive it threatened to bring down more than one career? Because by the end of this story, what began as a single slap would expose hidden power struggles, reveal dangerous allegiances inside the department, and force a reckoning within the very halls of justice. And the most shocking twist? The woman Ramirez thought he silenced would take her rightful seat in the courtroom again, only this time, every word she spoke would determine not his freedom, but his fate. Judge Naomi Carter had dedicated 25 years of her life to upholding the law. From the very first day she donned her robe, she carried herself with the kind of resolve that only comes from a life carved by struggle. She was the daughter of factory workers, raised in a neighborhood where justice was too often decided in the streets rather than the courts. For Naomi, the courtroom was sacred ground. Every verdict she delivered was deliberate, every decision weighed carefully, and every word spoken with the weight of accountability. Her colleagues respected her toughness, but what set her apart was her compassion. Defendants and victims alike walked away from her courtroom knowing she had seen them as human beings. That morning, as she walked into work clutching her briefcase, her only thoughts were on the docket waiting for her inside. She had no idea the same system she protected was about to strip her of her humanity in front of the world. On the opposite end of the spectrum stood Officer Blake Ramirez. To the public, Ramirez was a decorated veteran of the force, a man with medals pinned neatly to his chest and a reputation for fearlessness in the line of duty. But to those inside the department, his story was different. Whispers trailed him through every precinct, complaints of excessive force, racial slurs shouted during arrests, and reports of unnecessary violence, all quietly dismissed, all buried under paperwork, all excused as misunderstandings. He had friends in high places who ensured his record stayed clean, who believed keeping him on the streets was more valuable than holding him accountable. His confidence grew with every incident that went unpunished. By the time he arrived at the courthouse that morning, Blake Ramirez was a man who believed he was untouchable. And in his eyes, anyone who challenged that belief, especially a black woman in power, was a threat to be crushed. Judge Naomi Carter and Officer Blake Ramirez lived in the same city, served under the same system, but inhabited two entirely different worlds. Naomi was a guardian of justice, believing that truth and fairness could prevail if people had the courage to uphold them. Ramirez was the enforcer of intimidation, believing fear was stronger than fairness and violence was faster than due process. Their paths should never have crossed in the way they did. Yet destiny placed them on a collision course that morning. Naomi walked into work expecting to preside over arguments that would test her patience and skill as a judge. Instead, she found herself accused, humiliated, and brutalized by the very hand of the law she had sworn to uphold. And what neither of them realized was that their confrontation would not just expose their differences, it would ignite a firestorm that shook the courthouse, the department, and the entire community to its core. On that morning, the air outside the courthouse was ordinary lawyers in press suits hurried through the doors, clerks balanced files in their arms, and citizens queued nervously for hearings that would alter their lives. Judge Naomi Carter approached the entrance with her briefcase tucked close, her stride steady, her mind already deep in the cases she was set to hear. But before she could step inside, Officer Blake Ramirez intercepted her path. His eyes scanned her not with curiosity but with hostility, and within seconds he barked an order for her to stop. Startled, Naomi identified herself calmly. "I'm Judge Carter. I have court this morning." Yet Ramirez sneered, unmoved by her words. He muttered under his breath about her looking suspicious, claiming she might be carrying stolen legal documents. The accusation was absurd, but his tone carried the weight of authority, and in that instant, the tension on those courthouse steps shifted violently. Witnesses would later describe how fast it unfolded. Ramirez closed the distance, snatched at her briefcase, and when she resisted, his open palm struck across her face so hard it echoed off the marble columns. The blow was sharp, humiliating, and deliberate. Naomi staggered, her papers bursting into the air like shrapnel from a wound. People gasped, but no officer stepped forward to stop him. Instead, a few chuckled, one even lifting a phone to record as though it were theater. Ramirez twisted her arm behind her back, snapping cold handcuffs onto her wrists, and forced her toward the ground. She pleaded again, stating her name, her position, her purpose for being there. But every word was drowned out by his derision. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in here." And the laughter of his colleagues drove the knife in deeper. To them, this wasn't misconduct, it was entertainment. Dragged inside the very courthouse she was sworn to oversee, Naomi's dignity unraveled with each step. Her robe, folded neatly in her chambers, awaited her, but instead of donning it with authority, she was shoved into a chair at the defendant's table. Her lip was swollen, her wrists raw from the metal biting into her skin, and the sting of humiliation burned hotter than the pain. She lifted her head, scanning the courtroom she knew better than anyone. And there it was, her nameplate resting on the judge's bench, gleaming under the lights just feet away. The irony cut like glass. She was the rightful occupant of that seat, yet now she was displayed as a criminal in the very hall where she had dedicated her life to dispensing justice. 20 feet away from the courtroom where she was scheduled to preside, Judge Naomi Carter sat bruised, cuffed, and accused by the very system she had sworn to protect. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Officer Blake Ramirez took the stand. His uniform was pressed, his posture perfect, and his voice carried the same confidence he had used to silence Naomi on the courthouse steps. With deliberate certainty, he painted a picture of a suspicious woman loitering near the entrance. A briefcase he claimed contained stolen files, and her alleged refusal to comply with his orders. Each sentence dripped with authority, and the temporary presiding judge, Judge Robert Harrison, leaned forward, nodding as though Ramirez's every word carried the weight of truth. The prosecutor, eager to secure a quick ruling, reinforced his testimony, casting Naomi as an agitator who resisted lawful commands. And one by one, other officers echoed Ramirez's story, their voices rehearsed, their lies woven into a fabric so seamless it seemed unbreakable. But beneath her bruises, Naomi Carter sat silently, eyes sharp, waiting for her moment to strike. When her turn finally came, Naomi did not raise her voice, nor did she waste words on anger. Instead, she spoke with the precision that 25 years on the bench had honed. She reminded the court of constitutional protections, citing precedents where unlawful arrests were overturned, where fabricated charges were exposed, and where the abuse of authority had toppled decorated officers before. She dissected Ramirez's testimony line by line, exposing contradictions so subtle the prosecutors squirmed with each correction. Where Ramirez claimed she resisted, she pointed to her injuries consistent only with compliance. Where he accused her of carrying stolen documents, she noted the chain of custody proving the papers were her official docket for the day's proceedings. Her calm dismantling of his lies was not the furious outburst they expected. It was methodical, devastating, and impossible to ignore. And in the stillness that followed her words, the authority in the room shifted, piece by piece, back into her hands. Yet the battle was far from over. Ramirez smirked through her rebuttals, confident the weight of his badge, the backing of his fellow officers, and the prosecutor's eagerness to close ranks would shield him. Judge Harrison appeared reluctant to entertain Naomi's arguments fully, his gavel quick to silence her whenever she pressed too close to the truth. The officers sat stiff, maintaining the facade of unity, their glances betraying just enough unease to hint at cracks forming in their wall of lies. What none of them realized was that the courthouse itself had been watching. Its cameras, mounted high above the steps and the hallways, had recorded every moment. Ramirez, in his arrogance, had forgotten the eye that never blinks. The footage had not yet been introduced, but the shadow of its existence lingered like a storm cloud above the proceedings. Every word Ramirez spoke dripped with authority. And yet, in his rush to control the narrative, he had forgotten one devastating detail. The officer thought he was testifying against a criminal. Instead, he had been perjuring himself against the very judge who could end his career. For nearly an hour, Officer Blake Ramirez spun his narrative with the arrogance of a man who had never been challenged, a man who believed his badge and his allies could shield him from consequence. But then, Naomi Carter rose slowly from her chair. Her wrists bore the red marks of the cuffs that had bound her. Her face carried the bruises of his assault, yet her composure was unshaken. In a steady voice, she requested the preservation of all courthouse surveillance footage from that morning. The courtroom, once filled with whispers, fell into silence. Ramirez's eyes flickered just for a moment, but in that fleeting glance, the mask of confidence cracked. Naomi wasn't pleading anymore, she was commanding, and every official in the room felt it. From her briefcase, which Ramirez had once accused of holding stolen files, Naomi drew 3 items. First, her judicial identification card, bearing her photograph and seal, then her electronic access card, encoded for restricted areas of the courthouse no criminal would ever enter. Finally, her parking pass, issued only to sitting judges, with her name etched in bold. She held them high for the courtroom to see. A murmur spread through the gallery as realization swept across the faces watching. The bailiff stepped forward, studying the documents, then looked back at Naomi, as if seeing her for the very first time. His jaw tightened, his eyes widened. This was no defendant. This was the judge of the very courtroom they sat in. The air shifted sharply. It was no longer Naomi who stood on trial, but Blake Ramirez himself. And in that moment, his confidence evaporated. Judge Robert Harrison, who had nodded along to Ramirez's every word, stammered from the bench. His gavel, so quick to silence Naomi earlier, now hesitated in his grip. He cleared his throat, attempted to reassert order, but the authority in the room had shifted beyond his control. Prosecutors exchanged uneasy glances. Officers shifted in their seats. The gallery leaned forward, transfixed. Naomi didn't shout. She didn't demand, she simply existed in the power that had always been hers. Each second stretched longer than the last as the truth of who she was settled like a weight on the room. Then she turned, leaned close to the bailiff, and with a calm whisper that only he could hear, gave a simple instruction. Bring her robes and her gavel. The room froze. The meaning was unmistakable. The judge was about to take her seat again. In less than an hour, Officer Ramirez went from accuser to accused, from hero to handcuffed. The shift began the moment Judge Naomi Carter returned to the courtroom not as a defendant, but as herself. The heavy oak doors opened, and all eyes turned as she walked in with measured steps, her black robe flowing behind her, the gavel firm in her grasp. The gallery gasped audibly. Jurors, attorneys, even Judge Robert Harrison froze in place. Ramirez's face drained of color, his posture shrinking under the weight of recognition. He had struck a judge in public, then lied under oath, and now the authority he thought he destroyed stood stronger than ever. Naomi took her rightful place at the bench, sat tall, and allowed the silence to stretch until the tension was unbearable. Then, with one strike of her gavel, she ordered the courtroom into session, not for her, but for him. The order came swiftly. Play the footage. The bailiff wheeled in the screen, and the room darkened as the first frames lit up. Every second of the assault unfolded before their eyes: the slap, the jeers of fellow officers, the brutal twist of Naomi's arm, the mockery of law on the very steps of justice. His words, once denied, now echoed in surround sound. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in here." The gallery recoiled. Prosecutors' faces paled. Judge Harrison, once confident, shifted uneasily in his chair. Ramirez sat frozen, his arrogance replaced with dread, his lies dissolving frame by frame. Each angle, each second, was damning, and by the time the footage ended, the silence was deafening. Naomi looked down from the bench, her eyes fixed on Ramirez. The bailiff stepped forward and, without waiting for further instruction, placed the officer in cuffs. The man who once believed himself untouchable was now led away as a criminal. As Ramirez was escorted past the gallery, the same officers who had once laughed with him stared at the floor, unable to meet Naomi's gaze. The unity they had displayed in false testimony shattered under the weight of undeniable evidence. Naomi, still bruised but unbroken, addressed the room with clarity that cut through the silence. "This is what abuse of power looks like." Her words weren't for Ramirez alone. They were for every officer who had chosen silence over integrity, every official who had looked away, every citizen who doubted the system could protect them. The gavel struck again, echoing like a thunderclap. Justice had not only been restored, it had been reclaimed. And as Naomi Carter sat in her rightful chair, the courtroom understood. She had not been the victim of the system. She had been its reminder, its conscience, its reckoning. And Ramirez's downfall was only the beginning of a larger storm. So here's the question. Was justice truly served? Yes, Officer Blake Ramirez was stripped of his badge, led away in handcuffs, and branded a liar before the world. But is that enough for a man who abused his power so brazenly, who struck a sitting judge outside her own courthouse, then perjured himself on the stand without a flicker of remorse? Should Ramirez spend years behind bars for his assault and his lies under oath? Or was the public humiliation, the collapse of his career, and the disgrace he now carries punishment enough? The answer isn't simple, and maybe that's the point. Judge Naomi Carter's ordeal forces us to ask not just what happens when one man crosses the line, but what happens when an entire system looks away until the truth can no longer be denied. But what do you think? Should Ramirez face prison time? Or has justice already been delivered? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you thought this story was shocking, you haven't seen anything yet. Because next time, we uncover the chilling moment when a billionaire's maid stumbled onto a secret worth millions, a secret that nearly cost her life. That story is coming up next. So make sure you hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us for more stories that others are too afraid to tell. Because the truth, no matter how dark, always finds its way to the light.